Glorious devotees, thank you for coming to another presentation on Śrīla Jīva Gosvāmī's Sandarbhas. Today we'll be discussing the ontology, or the metaphysic of the Sandarbhas, or what is the knowable and how do we ascertain the knowable based on the evidence that has been determined to be the most reliable. To begin today, we're going to do a quick overview of where we've been. In the beginning of the book, of course, there was the auspicious invocation, the Mangalacharna, and in the 8th anuccheda of that 8 anuccheda Mangalacharna, Śrīla Jīva Gosvāmī revealed the subject of his book. In one feature, Sri Krishna exists as pure consciousness without any manifest characteristic, and is referred to as Brahman in some portions of the Vedas. In another feature, he expands as the parāsya, who regulates the extrinsic potency Maya by his many plenary portions. In yet another of his principal forms, he is Narayan, resplendent in the spiritual sky, Vaikuntha. May that Sri Krishna, the original, complete, absolute truth, Swayam Bhagavān, bestow love for himself on those who worship his lotus feet in this world. As noted, this is the seed conception of the Sandarbhas that will be fully unpacked in Śrīla Jīva Gosvāmī's presentation. We go on in the next anuccheda, which is a review of the epistemology. In other words, we're searching for knowledge. Now, where are we going to go for that knowledge, and what is going to be the determination of the validity of that source? Epistemological validity of the Vedas, Itihasas, and Puranas culminating in Śrīmad Bhāgavatam. The topic of epistemology is indispensable to an investigation of truth. For how can we claim to know anything in truth if our means for knowing it be flawed or uncertain? It would remain at best an approximation subject to further review. So, before embarking on a deliberation of the core truths of Sambandha, Abhideya, and Prayojan, it is crucial that a valid praman, or means of valid knowing, be ascertained. We can see that Jiva is laying the groundwork. Now, what's interesting in our epistemological approach is we're looking for a comprehensive understanding of the nature of being, both internal, what are we as an individual, and what's the nature of the entire cosmic manifestation that we find ourselves in. So we're looking for a truly absolute and fully comprehensive source for knowledge, which will address both personal revelation as to the nature of our being, and even go further than that and provide us with a comprehensive understanding of the environment we find ourselves in. What is the source of that? First, we come to what are we going to use as the basis for acquiring knowledge? Jiva explains to us what is the significance of having a valid epistemological basis for an inquiry. He first delivers to us the sound understanding that we can't base any knowledge that we receive through our senses and our mind. We can't really consider that wholly reliable, because our senses are not absolutely perfect. They are imperfect. And he gives some other flaws there. We make mistakes. We sometimes are predisposed to a particular way of seeing things. And sometimes we're just in illusion based on the environment, as we know from the philosophy of Krishna consciousness and the philosophy of the self. This is a world of illusion, Maya. And the way one person sees something and another person sees something can be entirely different. He, after comprehensively reviewing and introducing us to the whole idea of Sabda Brahman, sound vibration that comes from a transcendental source, after he discusses that and explains what is the significance of Vedic knowledge being a Purushaya, or descending, then he gradually, step by step, builds the case for the fact that if we're going to go to a comprehensive source for knowledge, there's no better source than the Śrīmad Bhāgavatam. He says in his 26th anuccheda, consequently, while some scholars conclude that other Puranas are dependent upon the Vedas to derive their authority, Śrīmad Bhāgavatam explicitly refutes the possibility that it may be dependent in this way. Rather, the Bhagavatam stands on its own authority. For this reason, it is in fact the highest manifestation of Shruti, the original Veda. And that brings us up to ontology. So we've determined there has to be a valid means of knowing, and he's provided us with arguments to the effect that we can find a valid means in the Bhagavat Purana. So what are we going to find there? If it is a comprehensive source for knowledge about both ourselves and everything that we perceive, and all that is not perceptible by our senses, if it has that, then what's this great literature all about? What's knowable? What is of value to us about ourselves? What's of value in knowledge about the environment? And what's of value to us about that which lies beyond our direct perception? Jiva's metaphysics for determination of the knowable. And the Sanskrit term for knowable is prameya. So pramana is the means of knowing, and prameya is that which is knowable. Śrī Jīva begins an analysis to determine, from a transcognitive perspective, the subject, the means, and the goal of the Bhagavat Purana, the prameya. In doing so, he adopts a unique approach in which the subject, means, and goal are shown to be not logical propositions, but directly cognized truths from the trans-empirical states of awareness of Sri Sukha and Sri Vyas. In our last discussion, we were introduced to the fact that this Bhagavat Purana, it has some very distinctive features. And those features are the author of the Purana and the speaker of the Purana both had revolutionary experience beyond sensual experience that led to the introduction of this knowledge to human society. And he first went over, in brief, Sukadev's unique position. Sukadev was already a man free of the world as far as wanting to exploit the world for some purpose, knowing that the world itself was truly a place that, although there were many temporary purposes, it offered no comprehensive solution. All it had to offer was a repetition of repeated birth and death. So as far as you can go in material life through sense perception and the utilization of the mind and inference of all that you can take in, ultimately all that ends in material destruction. He was a man free of that. He had already come to that realization, and he was himself situated in walking samadhi. He was liberated, although walking in the world. So Jiva introduced that, and then he introduced what brought the author of the Bhagavatam to represent this Purana as the topmost praman, or evidence regarding spirituality. And that was the author himself, Śrīla Vyasadeva. He had, through the grace of his spiritual master and the mercy of the Supreme Lord himself, was granted access to a transcognition, a state of awareness beyond what the senses and the world around him had to offer. And in that state, and Jiva Goswami goes into that revelation that he experienced, and he expands upon that. He unpacks that a little bit for us, showing us that he saw the Supreme Lord. He saw all of his Shaktis, and he saw that this one Shakti that comprised the material universe and the other Shakti, which is also a conscious potency of his, the Jiva, how they interacted and how the material nature was working upon the Jivas and keeping them in a state of ignorance, avidya. And then he saw the solution to that avidya, whereby that ignorance, which ultimately ends in suffering for the living entity, can be eradicated. And therefore, from that samadhi, he gave us a commentary on his samadhi. It's called a samadhi bhashya. His commentary is the Śrīmad Bhāgavatam. So we're going to continue where we left off, and we're going to continue here with the 32nd anuccheda. As again, I will remind you that we're not going in depth into the Tattva Sandarbha. We're just taking some high points. The individual self is distinct, conscious, and subject to self-ignorance. The method, abhideya, that facilitates ultimate attainment and the stage of completion to be attained, prayoja, as we have defined them, are based on the essential distinction between the Supreme Self and the individual self. It is precisely this inherent capacity of the living being to be conscious that refutes the contrary opinion that the jiva exists only as an apati of a Brahman, and that liberation is simply the elimination of this upadi. He continues in the 34th anuccheda. Although the jiva is purely conscious, Siddha-rupa, just like the Supreme Being, it is yet distinct from the Supreme Being. This distinction is clearly shown, on the one hand, by the words, Maya is apart from and yet supported by him, the Supreme Being. Tad apashraya. And on the other hand, by the phrase, the jiva is deluded by Maya. So jiva, again, he's unpacking the revelation of Śrīla Vyasadeva. So these quotes are from that portion of the Bhagavatam that details the revelation of Śrīla Vyasadeva and the verses that speak to that revelation and what Śrīla Vyasadeva experienced through self-identification as opposed to observation. That's the way it's spoken of, revelation. You can relate with it on a direct level. We're going to continue now, and although Śrīla Jīva Gosvāmī has not provided us with a Sandarbha on Brahman, even though he explained in the 8th anuccheda at the beginning of his Sandarbhas what was the subject, and he elaborated that it's seen differently as Brahman, Paramatma, and Bhagavān, And his personal verse is based on a verse from the Bhagavatam itself, Vedanti Tattva Vedas, Tattva Jnanamadvayam, Brahmeti Paramatmeti, Bhagavaniti Subjate. Learned transcendentalists approach this non-dual absolute differently, and they aspire to different revelation in regards to the absolute, and they also aspire to different attainments of spiritual perfection in relationship with those various visions. But we're not going to get a Brahman Sandarbha, because what is there to say of it? But at this point in his Tattva Sandarbha, he is going to give us some input as to what Brahman isn't. So he's going to point out where Advaita-vad, that it's all one, this idea, Brahman, Brahmeti, where Sankaracharya has led people astray. And that conception of the Supreme is commonly referred to the Mayavad conception. Or another way to look at it is radical non-dualism. It's non-dualistic thought, but it's radical in that it lies outside of common sense and outside of the jurisdiction of the Vedic conclusion. So there is the Brahman conception of the supreme absolute truth that is properly presented in the Vedas and represents an aspect of the supreme. And there is the radical non-dualistic idea regarding Brahman, which was introduced into society by Sankaracharya at the request of Krishna, of Lord Shiva. Please, you come and you misrepresent the Vedas, and then we'll have something to work on and we'll fix that. It's a long history, and I'm not going to go into it right now, but it was a necessary step to introduce this radical non-dualistic approach in order to pull people away from the voidist conception put forth by Lord Buddha, who had to introduce that conception in order to pull people away from a misutilization of the Vedic conclusion for their personal sense gratification. As we know, Buddha came along and he refuted the Vedas. He said, this sacrifice is not good. Take to the path of ahimsa. Don't be engaged in all these sacrifices for your benefit, because you're creating pain in the world. From that pain, nothing good can happen. No good can come, ultimately. So people were misusing the Vedas, just wanting the benefits of the sacrifices without seeing the purpose behind them. So along comes Buddha. He stops all the sacrifices. Along comes Sankaracharya to refute that aspect of Buddhism where we basically took the soul out of spiritual life, because he said, ultimately, it's all nothing, nirvana. You enter into a state of no karma, no nothing. Then Sankaracharya comes along and he says, well, no, we can go back to the Vedas and we can accept them in a way that allows us to see the position of our ultimate attainment as Brahman. And there's a distinction between nothing and spiritually something. So he introduced his philosophy. So now Jiva begins his introduction of the faults of the Mayavad, or the radical non-dualist conception of spirituality. Essential distinction between the jiva and isvara. According to the Advaita-vad doctrine of Sankaracharya, in the very moment that the one indivisible Brahman, whose nature is pure consciousness, becomes the support of Maya and the embodiment of knowledge as isvara, it simultaneously falls under Maya's influence and is overcome by ignorance as the jiva. Yet, this is illogical. Thus, we can understand that the jiva and the Supreme Lord are distinct entities. However, since their inherent capacities are different, Ishvara as the controller of Maya and the jiva as subordinated by Maya, the jiva and the Lord are distinct in their essential natures. So he's pointing out Sankaracharya's philosophy is really, it doesn't make sense. It's illogical because he's saying, first of all, that Brahman, which has no qualities, it has no distinct characteristics. That's what we mean when we refer to the Supreme Absolute as Brahman. Now we understand, from the proper understanding, Brahman means it has no material characteristics. But that's not Sankaracharya's presentation. When you turn matter off, you're left in this spiritual place of Brahman, but it has no characteristics. That's one aspect of the Supreme. It has no material characteristics. So if we just want to take that, we refer to as the Brahmavad approach, or that Brahmavad conception of the Supreme Absolute Truth. We're going to discuss what is the philosophy of Mayavad at its base. The Mayavadis say that the radical non-dualists, their conception is, if you take Brahman and you impose the idea of Maya upon it, and that Maya is of the mode of ignorance, the absence of knowledge, then you get the conception of the jiva. Of course, in this anuccheda, he's saying this makes no sense. If Brahman has no characteristics and everything is coming from Brahman, then how can an aspect of Brahman, Maya, influence it? It doesn't make any sense. So the proper understanding is there is the supreme and there is the subordinate living entity, which are both conscious of the nature of Brahman. That's a common characteristic. He goes on and he's going to expand a little more just so we kind of get the point. The jiva is not merely the product of an upadi of Brahman. And this is what Sankarya says it is. Also, the radical non-dualist position of Sri Sankara cannot explain away this difference between the jiva and the Supreme Being as no more than a division or a reflection of Brahman into a hierarchy of upadis. Again, their philosophy is, if Brahman is influenced by Maya, which is its manifestation because Brahman is everything, if Brahman can influence itself by ignorance, we have the jiva. And if Brahman can influence itself by goodness, then we have what we refer to as a supreme being, Isvara. But how can either of these upadis, these influences, come upon Brahman in the first place? It makes no sense. Therefore, Śrīla Jīva Gosvāmī now introduces inconsistencies in radical non-dualism, Advaitavad, and refutes the idea of pratibimba, reflection, and paricheda. In other words, these are two ideas that the Advaitins, the radical non-dualists, used to explain their philosophy. That Brahman is reflected into Maya, into the material manifestation, or Brahman is cut up into little pieces and then if you're liberated, moksha means you re-merge into Brahman. You realize that that was just an illusion. So the illusion was either a reflection of Brahman into a manifestation of the energy of Brahman called Maya, or we take Brahman and we conceive of Brahman being cut into little pieces, which are jīvas, and therefore when you realize that it's really not cut up into little pieces, then you're liberated, and that's called moksha. Jiva now goes on in his 37th anuccheda to point out these flaws. If we assume that these upadis, upadi means that we're taking an outside influence and putting it on something. If we assume that these upadis are real because of their empirical validity, still, because Brahman is not subject to any influence, it cannot be delimited by them. Moreover, Brahman can cast no reflection because it is devoid of attributes, all-pervading and indivisible, without parts. Since Brahman has no attributes, it can have no relation with upadis. Since it is all-pervading, it cannot be divided into an object and its reflection. And since it is individual and uniform, it cannot be seen. If, however, there are real upadis delimiting Brahman, parāsya, or acting as the medium of its reflection, pratibimba, a person could not get rid of them simply by intuitive knowledge of his essential oneness with the Supreme. And if the radical non-dualists propose that freedom from upadis is due to the influence of the Supreme Entity referred to by the pronoun tat, then they are in agreement with our view. Then they agree that there has to be a Supreme Personality which invokes his will upon the material energy, and therefore the ultimate is not Brahman, because now we have an outside influence which is controlling Brahman. When we go through this section of the Tattva and Sandarbha with any kind of attention to the detail that Jīva Gosvāmī's given to it, we cannot walk away with anything but a chuckle when we conceive of this Mayavad philosophy. It does not hold logical water. There's no way that you can take it anywhere because it makes no sense. Brahman cannot be influenced by anything, but you're saying Brahman can be cut up into little pieces, or Brahman can reflect itself into a vast expanse of itself and produce the material experience. And because the radical non-dualist conception of Brahman is it has no characteristics, then that would make the jiva more powerful than Brahman, because at least ourselves as jiva, we know we have consciousness. We know we exist. Brahman has no capacity in and of this conception of Brahman, this radical non-dualistic conception of Brahman, to arrive at those conclusions. We'll go on with a little bit more. In this way, by basing their ideas on Brahman and avidya, ignorance alone, the Advaitavadis contradict themselves when they say that the one undivided Brahman, pure by virtue of being unadulterated consciousness, and thus altogether free from contact with avidya, is nonetheless polluted by contacting avidya, and thus becomes a jiva. Then again, the Advaitavadis claim that the same Brahman becomes the Supreme Being, Ishvara, owing to his being the shelter of Maya, the phenomenal world appearance, which is itself a fabrication of the jiva's avidya. What do we need to say about what Jiva has presented here? This encapsulates the fallacy and the utter absurdity of the Mayavad philosophy. And believe me, there are thousands upon thousands of followers of Sankaracharya that can sit down and utilize the Vedas to put forth this conception of radical non-dualism or Mayavad, and they're very expert at putting forth this conclusion, and so expert that the neophyte Vaishnav is warned and cautioned, do not associate with these individuals. They can assail you with their word jugglery of the Vedas in such a way that you yourself will become bewildered by what they put forward. And it can influence your proper understanding as you're receiving in disciplic succession. We're given all caution. Avoid this association. We don't need to discuss this. You'd say, well, why is Jiva taking the time to put it out there? He's putting it out there so we can recognize it for what it is. And he does it in the context of giving us the comprehensive understanding from the Bhagavat of what is Sambandha, Abhideya, and Prayojan proper understanding, the proper practice, and the proper attainment to be had by serious spiritual inquiry based upon the Śrīmad Bhāgavatam. He goes on in that same anuccheda, and yet that very Brahman supposedly again becomes the jiva due to the influence of Ishvara's Maya. These two states, however, are clearly incompatible. The inevitable contradictions implicit in this view are that avidya is able to infiltrate pure consciousness, Brahman. That vidya knowledge is present within Ishvara, who is nonetheless an upadi upon Brahman, fabricated out of that avidya. And that although Ishvara is the proprietor of vidya, knowledge, he is yet illusory in nature. We should carefully analyze how these and other speculative ideas are simply incoherent. And we can see here also from the Vaishnav point of view, and specifically our Gaudiya Vaishnav point of view, how those that take up this understanding of the nature of being, this radical non-dualistic understanding called Mayavad, they become offenders at the lotus feet of the Supreme Lord because their understanding is incoherent. But not only is it incoherent, but when they conceive of the Supreme Lord, he has no characteristics. He can't see, he can't walk, he can't move, he can't create, he can't, because why? From their viewpoint, God is simply imposition on Brahman of ignorance in the ultimate issue. Although they conceive of, well, the Ishvara portion, where when we come to understanding an Ishvara, we're talking about somebody not influenced by ignorance, although the complete influence that of the realm that he exerts himself in is created by ignorance. It's incoherent, as Jīva Gosvāmī says. And then he goes on. Śrīla Vyasadev's direct experience, his samadhi, it doesn't reconcile with this absolute non-distinction that's being spoken of by Sankaracharya. Furthermore, if the absolute oneness of the jīvas with Brahman were the actual purport of Śrīmad Bhāgavatam, Sutta Goswami would have reported that what Śrīla Vyasadeva witnessed in the state of samadhi was how the one Brahman becomes divided due to ignorance, and how knowledge dispels the suffering caused by this duality. And if Bhagavan's divine play and qualities were unreal, it would contradict what Sri Sukadeva experienced in his heart. Sukadeva Goswāmī, he was already liberated. He had attained moksha. He understood he was not part and parcel of the material energy. He was a jivan mukta. Although walking in the world, he was free of the world. Although being in the world, he was aware of his inner self. And despite that complete awareness of his spiritual nature and his nature being completely independent of what was happening around him in the material realm, irrespective of that profound realization, we would call walking samadhi, when he heard the nectarine verses from the Bhagavad Purana about the characteristics of the supreme personality of Godhead, he was attracted. Now, those characteristics could not have come from any material thing, or they would not have attracted him. That is the key to our understanding of what the Bhagavad Purana has to offer us. It has to offer us that revelation, not from a knowledge viewpoint, but from an experiential viewpoint, because the book itself is revelation. It speaks to what is our essence. It has its own agenda of liberating us from the ignorance that's imposed upon us by the Lord's external energy. Now he goes on to explain valid interpretation of non-distinction as inconceivable one in distinction. The famous ideal and idea of our Gaudiya tradition is now presented by Jīva Gosvāmī. Therefore, spiritual statements referring to the jivas as non-different from Brahman should be consistently reconciled so as to concur with the conclusions Vyasa came to in the state of samadhi. This is accomplished by first removing the apparent contradiction in the jivas being both different and non-different from Brahman. We should understand from the statements teaching non-difference that the jivas are one with Brahman in that both are pure consciousness. Yet, by Brahman's inherent inconceivable potency, which renders possible even the otherwise impossible, the jivas are also innately distinct from Brahman in terms of their being his parts, like the infinitesimal rays of the sun's light. Acintya-bheda-abheda Tattva. Inconceivably, simultaneously one with that supreme, absolute, and distinct from it, in that we have our individualized consciousness. The proper understanding, inconceivable oneness and distinction. In summary, what follows are the ideas underlying the Vedic statements that speak of the oneness of Brahman and the jivas, employing the analogies of reflection and delimitation. In the scriptures, we will not deny that these terms, pratibimba and praticheta, are there, but this is the way to understand them, and Jiva's giving that way. The jiva, like Brahman, is by nature purely consciousness. The jiva, like Brahman, is distinct from phenomena. The jiva is one of Brahman's energies. The jiva is eternally dependent on Brahman. the jiva can never be absolutely one with Brahman. The jiva is constitutionally an eternal servitor of Brahman. The analogies of reflection and delimitation help us to understand the purely spiritual nature of Brahman. A causal devotion is the abhidheya. Jiva continues in the 44th anuccheda, since the Supreme Being and the individual being thus have distinct identities, the Supreme Being is the foundation and support of Maya, and the individual being as deluded by her, it is concluded that devotional worship, bhajan, of the Supreme Being is specifically the means, abhidheya, that effectuates the stage of ultimate attainment. And the ultimate completion, prayojan. Again, remember what Jiva is doing here is he's providing an overview in his Tattva Sandarbha, which is going to be completely elaborated on as he unpacks various spiritual conclusions based upon the Bhagavat Purana, supporting those conclusions by the great acharyas that came before Ramanuj, Madhvacharya, the great thinkers, the great commentators, specifically Sridhar Swami. Madhvacharya, of course, had a tremendous library, and in his various commentaries, he drew from all those great Vaishnavas that came before. And now Jiva is placing Lord Chaitanya's Gaudiya Vaishnavism on the spiritual map. And it so happens that the location of it is the center of the universe of spirituality. In fact, it is that sun which illuminates all the other spiritual conceptions and spiritual texts. From the above discussion, it is definitely concluded that Sri Bhagavān, the original complete person, is the most deserving recipient of supreme transcendental love. Because he instructs all people about their ultimate welfare, because he removes all sorrows, because he is the supreme self of everyone, like the sun in relation to its rays, and because he is perfectly endowed with all wonderful qualities. This being the case, it naturally also follows that love for him is the final attainment, prayojan. And now we come to that conclusion that we've touched upon already. Even an Atmarama, someone that's completely self-satisfied in the nature of their spiritual being, will be attracted by this great literature, just as Sukadeva was. Srila Vyasadeva, knowing that Sukadeva could be subdued by Śrīmad Bhāgavatam alone and not by any other means, somehow induced him to hear a few select Bhagavatam verses depicting Sri Krishna's all-exceeding qualities. In this way, he caused Sukadeva's heart to become captivated, and later he taught him the entire narrative. This episode speaks of the supreme glory of Śrīmad Bhāgavatam. If it can attract people of the caliber of a Sukadeva Goswāmī, these are the topmost transcendentalists that walk in human society amongst us. If it can attract those individuals, who can question its glory? Consequently, one should thoroughly investigate the essential truth, tatparya, of Śrīmad Bhāgavatam that is in perfect accordance with the heart of its speaker and not otherwise. By implication, all explanations that do not accord with the speaker's heart simply lead one astray from the proper conclusion. And we know that the speaker's heart, Sukadeva's true feelings regarding the Bhagavatam, are fully expressed in the 10th canto. So much so that Maharaj Parikshit's son was ready in the wings to immediately begin a kirtan if Sukadeva was so much overwhelmed in prema for Krishna through the narration which he was sharing with Maharaj Parikshit. if we can truly enter into the mystery of the speaker's heart, as we can through his presentation of the Lord's most intimate pastimes with his topmost associates, if we see everything in the light of that, then our understanding of the Bhagavatam will be proper and will be fully beneficial to us. Now, Jīva Gosvāmī will go on by a comparison of the revelation of Śrīla Vyasadeva, the author, and Śrīla Sukadeva, the speaker. The Bhagavatam is coming forth from their personal revelation. Now, how are we, who don't have yet that revelation, to benefit from the Bhagavatam, and how are we to enter into the mysteries of Sambandha from our vantage point? So going forward, Jīva Gosvāmī is going to first give us a viewpoint of Sambandha, Abhideya, and Prayojan in terms of that which we are familiar with, ourself, the nature of what we can observe in ourselves. So he goes first there through observing the individual self, then he takes it further, and now we can also understand the significance of Sambandha, Abhideya, and Prayojan by observing what is in the environment around us. And the environment around us constitutes all those items presented in the Bhagavatam: creation, subcreation, maintenance, destruction, liberation, all sheltered under the supreme Ashraya, Bhagavān. He's going to give us a perspective of how we can look at acquiring this knowledge by looking at our own situation and then looking out to the world through the eyes of the Bhagavatam. And the Bhagavatam is a major Purana, so it has 10 major subjects. And he's going to review those with us, and then he's going to conclude his Tattva Sandarbha there and give us entrance into these conceptions of spiritual reality, Paramatma, Bhagavān, and then Krishnastu Bhagavan Swayam. So I'll end there, and thank you for your kind association. Vanchakalpadubhascha, Kripsanabevacha, Patitanam, Pavanebhyo, Vaishnavijya Namo Namaha.
Krishna Kirtana Gana Natana Pano Premamritam Mani